Hello, I'm Dave from PC Gamer, and I'm here with Jacob and Alan to talk about Intel's new technology shares, because Jacob's been down at the Intel Architecture Day 2021 to hear all about it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So, what's the deal then? What's the deal, Jacob? What's going on?
There's quite a few deals. There's quite a few things going on.
What are deals? Nice.
Well, yeah, there's quite a few things that we've heard about for quite a while, and Intel's finally gone, we'll take the lid off that now, which has been nice, because we've been chatting rumors about its new graphics card, DG2, now Alchemist. We've been chatting about Alder Lake for ages, and we've been chatting about even potentially something similar to DLSS or FSR, like an upscaling technology. And now Intel's just said, look, here's a bunch of this stuff. Some of the specifications for some things it's still not quite ready to talk about yet, but for the most part, we've got a pretty good idea now what to expect from both CPU and GPU technologies that Intel's working on. Okay,
so what do we want to start with? What was the most exciting thing that sort of like came out of the day for you?
It's got to be Xe-HPG, I think. To jump in right onto the graphics side of things. I mean, it's PC Gamer. We're going to be obsessed with the graphics cards, I think. But we're big fans of DLSS, and AMD's FSR's just come out, and then that's offering a whole different thing for an open ecosystem for this. And they're essentially just upscaling technologies that take the pre-existing frame that you're rendering, and through some form of magic, be that AI or otherwise, they'll upscale it to make it look better, but without increasing the performance load. And now Intel's come out and said, oh yeah, we're doing one of them. So we can expect Xe-SS, Xe super sampling.
So is that how they pronounce that thing? So it's not XS then? They're not going down.
That's actually such a good point. I have not thought about it. They have not said XS at all.
Okay.
I don't think they have.
That's interesting.
Not Z.
That's great. XS is an incredible marketing name for that, and they should hire you immediately. But no, they sorry, Alan.
Is it so? Obviously, NVIDIA uses AI or deep learning to do DLSS. Is this like NVIDIA, or is it more like AMD? Is it?
So yeah, that's a good question, I think, because me and Dave were looking at the AMD FSR patent a while back, and Dave pointed out that the way that Intel's saying that it does a few things with Xe-SS kind of looks like a similar way to how AMD is doing it, but in the same sense that NVIDIA also does quite a lot of those things too. So I think we're still trying to figure out really how it's going to work. I think the end result's going to be the same. They're promising a huge uplift in performance, and it'll look closer to the native image than you'd normally be able to get to. So in terms of performance, they're saying you get 1080p low settings image, if that's the max your hardware can do, and it can upscale that to 4K, and you can play at 4K, or generally a 2 times performance boost, which slightly doesn't quite match exactly, but roughly then we can kind of guess as to where it's going to end up.
I think the more interesting thing is like whether they can hit those. Like the resolution thing's fine, but honestly, I don't really care about gaming at 4K. To be honest, if I'm only getting 1080p at low settings on my system, I'd rather have 1080p at high settings than sort of like jump up to 4K. It's like there's
a much more realistic goal.
And hopefully Xe super sampling will be able to do that. I think the interesting thing was one of the slides from the Architecture Day deck was talking about how the Xe super sampling works, and it was the idea of this camera jitter, which seemed to suggest a similar way to the sort of like the pixel shuffle that AMD's Fidelity FX was kind of using. Basically, it's taking images and just ever so slightly moving them around to show you the different pixels around an area, and then using AI power to interpret those images and just make a more sharper image using post-processing effects at the end. I think the other interesting thing is that Xe-SS is actually using hardware. It's using AI hardware within the graphics cards itself.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's using they call them extensions for the Xe architecture, And Xe-HPG is the one that powers the gaming graphics cards. They love a brand name at Intel. They've got so many, and they've been changing them all up, so that's great. But anyway, this has got this accelerator cores actually in the architecture, and they're saying that's going to help accelerate the Xe-SS upscaling in a similar way, I suppose, then to how NVIDIA would do it with DLSS. And they're saying, you need an RTX card, you have to upscale it with this. But in that same sense means that they're actually doing two versions of Xe-SS, one which uses the hardware acceleration, and another one which, while we don't have the details on, they're saying is using a more generic kind of base, and so that they can use it on integrated graphics and competitors' graphics cards. So in theory, they're kind of delivering both a DLSS proprietary thing and an AMD FSR non-proprietary, open, everyone can use it thing, both in Xe-SS, one package.
So I quite like that. They're sort of like going, well, so DLSS is good and FSR is good. Why don't we just do both? And I'm just like, hey, don't pick a side. Just go all in. I guess the real key is going to be about game support. I assume it's going to be totally reliant on developers having to put that in. They've spoken about having an SDK for Xe-SS going out this month. Have they given any indication about what games are going to use it or what will support it?
No, so far that's kind of details to be filled in at a later date. But yeah, we don't really know what games are going to support Xe-SS, or if they're going to need to train it on a per game basis. NVIDIA had that same thing with DLSS. The first few versions, it took you'd have to really specify everything. You'd have to train it on certain models, and then they kind of made it more general and it was easier to implement. And now, it's a plugin. You can just plug it in, it'll figure out your game and it'll run. So we don't know yet. We're not too sure with Xe-SS.
I guess the thing is, we've got a little time. If the SDK is going out now, you'd hope it doesn't have to go in at the start of the game's development. So fingers crossed. Games coming out around the same time that Alchemist, scheduled for Q1 2022. Hopefully there'll be some games that we can actually try Xe-SS on. Yeah,
hopefully.
Cool. So have they said anything more about the Alchemist graphics card? So this is I think this is the one of the most exciting things to happen in PC hardware for a while. Intel actually going to release a discrete graphics card. We were promised it this year. Obviously they've shifted that to next year now. But have they given any more details actually about what's going to be in there?
Yeah, so I think we kind of went in with some assumptions of what we'd kind of get out of this Xe-HPG graphics card, and they kind of now come out and said, oh, actually, we've got a whole different way of thinking about the kind of core structure. And again, it's kind of a bit of a rebrand, but I think it also plays into that they're changing quite a few things with that gaming specific architecture to create gaming graphics cards, as opposed to the data center ones we've already heard of, like the big HPC ones we've already heard of, and also the real small kind of iGPUs and the DG one that we saw before, and really small, low-powered ones. So they've actually now introduced the Xe core, which replaces the EU, which is kind of the traditional building block, like foundational block that we'd expect in an Intel iGPU traditionally, but now into discrete. But yeah, like I say, it's kind of a bit of a rebrand, but it's also kind of incorporating some other new things that we can expect with the graphics cards.
Yeah, so looking at the Xe core, it kind of looks a lot like a sort of like an NVIDIA SM, their streaming multiprocessor, because it's a chunk of graphic silicon housing. I assume the ALUs, they're sort of like their stream processors, as well as a bit of fixed function hardware and some low level cache. And then you can scale this up in the same way that sort of like Intel NVIDIA does that with their SMs to make up the full GPUs. Is that kind of what they're going with HPG, like this huge scalability type thing?
Yeah, and we're seeing it scale at a slightly different way to how they've already said that Ponte Vecchio, the big, extreme supercomputer GPU will scale. That's like massive, right? We're going to interconnect everything together, and we're not really sure how they're going to do interconnections, whatever. But at this point, we know that they're going to do, this Xe core, and then you have a certain number of Xe cores going into a render slice, and then that slice shares access to real-time ray tracing acceleration units and dedicated hardware for DX12 Ultimate as well. So you've got kind of all that good gaming stuff then put into the render slices, and then that scales out again to create a large gaming GPU up to, we're expecting quite a large size one that can compete with, NVIDIA's higher end cards. I'm not sure if it'll go all the way to the top, but pretty high.
Yeah, I think the rumors were suggesting something like a 3070 was kind of what they were targeting, which would be incredible, to be honest.
Yeah, and they've not said anything. Sorry to interrupt. They've not really said performance-wise anything like that. So we still don't know. That's still very much in rumor at this point. But from what we can see so far, it's going to be an interesting take on a gaming graphics card. Anyway,
it looks, in a way, it looks quite familiar, because you've got these sort of like their vector engines, which are going to be the sort of like where the stream processors are, and then you've got the matrix engines, which are these XMX blocks of hardware which help their AI for the Xe-SS. I presume like the matrix engines are going to do other things. Those XMX units are going to do other things, because they can't just be focused on Xe-SS when that's going to be not necessarily used on every single game.
Yeah, I believe they have spoken about some potential other uses. I think Xe-SS for gaming, or for PC gamers, is probably the most exciting thing. But I think as NVIDIA proved, there are other uses for using AI and acceleration on your graphics card, and I'm sure we'll figure out more.
There are other uses for graphics cards.
I don't want to hear of it.
No.
What the hell?
Outrageous. Interesting though, these chips are not going to be produced by Intel, are they? They're not being manufactured by Intel, which is the other thing out of this.
Yeah, that's the kind of interesting point, because they said they were going to do external foundries, and they were like, okay, right, we're going to do a few things on external foundries. And we're not really sure. Well, we kind of knew it was TSMC. I think we'd kind of guessed to that, but nobody was really sure what process node they're going to use or how they're going to use it. And now it's come out that, Alchemist graphics cards, those Xe-HPG graphics cards, will be TSMC's 6 nanometer N6 process node.
You're so resistant to calling it 6 nanometer, aren't you?
No. I'm fully down with the 6 nanometer now. Even if, it is totally made up marketing.
It's a completely
7
arbitrary
nanometer,
number,
but slightly improved with a bit of EUV process in there. So it's kind of like 7 nanometer, which is actually what AMD uses for all of its current gen CPUs and GPUs. So you'll see Intel and AMD both using very similar process nodes from the same manufacturer, which is interesting.
Does TSMC have the capacity to produce loads of cards? I mean, it's a bit worrying. Of all the times Intel is going to someone else for a new graphics card, very exciting, only to use TSMC again is just like...
It's one of those things, actually. It's a good point, because Intel's kind of managed to... They went from really bad supply to turning that around and saying, hey, we now have really good supply. And now when GPUs are hard to come by because supply is quite low, the one thing that they are not using their own internal fabs for, they're using someone else's, is for the graphics card. So, but it'll be early 2022.
I guess the saving grace is that you've got Apple have switched to 5 nanometer, so the 5N process. So they're not trying to swallow up any of the 6 nanometer process. We've not heard AMD shifting to 6 nanometer. I've got a feeling like the next gen ones were moving to 5 nanometer as well, weren't they?
Yes. So
potentially there's some space.
Potentially, but I've also heard that there have been reports that TSMC's 6 nanometer process, their fastest growing. Like, people are moving from 7 to 6 quite rapidly.
So it's design compatible as well. So if you've made something for 7 nanometer, it'll function
just simply
exactly
better. Probably has high yields, I guess.
Yeah, that was the process that AMD was going to use for its refresh, which it has cancelled now. So yeah, maybe there is spare capacity, and Intel stepped in. Maybe it all works out in the end.
It could all work out.
Maybe.
Yeah. Tell us about ray tracing.
Ray tracing, they're doing it.
Okay, move on.
But yeah, we really don't know anything more about the actual specific unit that they're using. It's quite similar to both how AMD and NVIDIA are doing it. We have a specific block on the card in the silicon that's dedicated to accelerating certain ray tracing tasks. But we're not quite sure how good it'll be at that job. NVIDIA, when they first introduced them, the gap between or the improvement in performance from the first generation to second generation was huge. And we don't know whether Intel's first gen straight out the gate will be up to par, but maybe it will.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think part of the issue for AMD is that they've still kind of offloaded quite a lot of the ray tracing workload goes onto the GPU itself, doesn't it? So as well as having these RT units or whatever they I can't remember how AMD defined their RT cores, but having their own, they've got fixed function silicon for ray tracing, but they still offload
accelerators, I believe.
No, that's it. But they still offload quite a lot of that ray tracing workload to the GPU itself. So there's still quite a lot of overhead on the GPU. Whereas on the NVIDIA side, the GPU is able to do a lot, most of its workload without having to worry about the ray tracing, because that all gets done separate on the pipeline to the actual rasterized workload. Be interesting to see what Intel's take is on that, whether it goes the route that NVIDIA has or whether it goes the route that AMD has.
Because NVIDIA always said that they were using tensor cores as well as a part of that to denoise the ray trace picture as well. So I wonder if, Intel does have that integrated AI accelerators in there as well now. So, perhaps there's something they can do there. But I still think that's a bit, we're just taking shots in the dark, I think, to the ray tracing performance of these cards, because we don't even know the rasterized performance of these cards. So yeah, but as far as we know, in terms of actual performance, rough, guidelines at the moment, they said that for frequency for the same voltage, they're getting about 1.5 times what Xe-LP could do, and that's the discrete card they've specifically put on their graphs. So that means that
so what was the frequency of that one?
Oh, that's a really good question. I do definitely not have that number to hand. While you're searching that, they've also said performance per watt is up 1.5 times as well from Xe-LP, because they've done a bunch of optimizations from everything from the physical design to circuitry to all sorts of different things to try and improve that too. So I think they want to try and crank it up for the gaming cards and push it a bit further.
So for reference, the boost clock on DG1, which was the initial discrete graphics card, was 1500 megahertz.
Okay, so that's actually not too bad then. If you're adding,
that's pretty quick. What's 150% of that? Yeah, so that would be 2,250 megahertz, which is a hell of a clock speed for a graphics chip.
Yeah, right up there with AMD's RDNA cards, which are also, like you say, on TSMC's process, done a lot of power optimization with the similar kind of thing, new methodologies and stuff. So yeah, maybe they're aiming up there.
It does feel a bit with Alchemist that the hardware is mostly done now, and we're at the software phase. We've got to get the drivers right. We've got to get all that right, and hopefully, by saying that they're not releasing this until Q1 2022, they'll get that right. Because I think a lot of people are still a bit. You don't quite know with Intel when it comes to their graphics performance what's holding it back. Hopefully, this work will now pay off, and they will just work.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the actual, like their diagrams for the chips themselves, there's a lot of fixed function units that they've dropped into the actual DG2 Alchemist GPU, the Xe-HPG. How many names have we got for this damn thing?
Intel Arc as well.
You missed.
The overarching brand name, Intel Arc. Yeah, so they got a lot of fixed function silicon dropped in there specifically for DirectX Ultimate performance. So they've got a lot of stuff, like dedicated hardware dropped into these GPUs to take the workload on. So they're really, I think they've spoken about this being a sort of like a gaming first GPU. So this is purely targeted at gaming performance. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they manage that.
Yeah, and it like you say, they've tweaked the architecture, and now they've got this Xe architecture, and then they've tweaked it down, and now we're seeing the actual gaming version of that. And it does seem like they really have tweaked it quite a bit to make a gaming specific version. So hopefully that plays. It increases the frame rates that we see in game when it arrives from what we've seen already of Xe.
And fingers crossed we'll actually see it running some games. We've had a little video of it, like early pre-production samples running games, but we don't really have any details about like performance settings or even frame rates. So like hopefully, like we're as we move through the rest of the year, we'll get a few more details about this upcoming graphics card, because Q1 2022 is far away now.
It's not as far as you think. Yeah.
No, it isn't, is it?
But
It's still not this year though, which is the frustrating thing. They promised me a graphics card this year.
But what is this year? Alder Lake. So let's
nice
swiftly go through that. Yeah, nice transition. You like that? Yeah, so they also spoke a bit more about Alder Lake, the upcoming CPU. Massive change in the architecture behind Alder Lake compared to Rocket Lake.
We've spoken about this being a big gamble, haven't we? Like this is Intel's big gamble to try and wrestle like performance processors back from AMD's Ryzen chips. Is it a gamble?
So I initially thought it was a huge gamble, and the more they talk about it, maybe I'm just buying into it more, but I'm starting to see why they're like saying, oh, actually this might be helpful. And I think at first it's going to take at first maybe it's not going to quite work out as well as it should for some things. So this is just basically off a hunch, but I just think it's going to take a while for software and everything to kind of get into the ecosystem where it's using Alder Lake and future hybrid architectures with big performance cores, which is what they call them now, performance cores, and small efficient cores, to offload different tasks to kind of gain performance and increase single thread and multi-thread, all sorts.
Because that's the big thing with Alder Lake, isn't it? It's like this is their first sort of like proper hybrid architecture. We've had Lakefield, which was like a dipping their toe in the water for having one big core and then like a set of smaller cores. But now they're going whole hog, having up to 8 big cores with hyper-threading, so you can have up to 16 threads of big, proper, like the sort of high-performance processor cores that we're kind of used to. But that's also being backed by up to 8 cores of these smaller like atom-based cores, which is what we used to have in like netbooks. Like that's the old perception.
And when you see them in a little diagram as well, you do really see the 4 little cores stuck in the diagrams anyway, of like where you would expect one big core. You just see 4 little ones clustered together.
But these aren't the atom cores of like the netbooks though. That's the thing. I think that's one of the reasons we were so sort of kind of maybe skeptical at the start. Like you talk about these little cores as atom cores, and it's like you're a bit disparaging about them. But they've given us a bit more of an update on what's actually going to be in these chips now.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why maybe I'm a bit more like, oh, okay, I'm starting to understand it a bit more from where they're coming from as to why it might be beneficial. Because these small cores, they're saying, are not only kind of up to Skylake level, Skylake being kind of the precursor to all the current gaming CPUs out of Intel.
Up to Comet Lake, really.
Yeah, it's been the way that the big performance cores until very recently, and now you're saying these big performance cores or something that's kind of roughly equivalent. You're going to stuff way more of them onto as an efficient core alongside high performance cores. And yeah, they're saying that they're going to be 40% more power efficient for the same performance, or 40% more performance than Skylake for the same power, and that they're going to be really good for multi-threaded tasks. And they're just going to basically just be that kind of they're not going to be the atom core that you expect, like you're saying. They're going to actually be something that, you can have a background app running on it. You can even have something that's quite fairly CPU intensive running on it, and it'll still probably be fine. And what that does is free up these performance cores to really give all to your priority application, which in our case will be gaming.
So they've spoken about it's the idea of game streaming. I think that's what they've spoken to as a really good use case example.
Yeah, I think that's the surprising thing for me, because I was unsure about how it would work with PC gaming, because we're so used to just having lots of performance, big cores, just brute force everything. Like, you have you're streaming at the same time you're playing a game, but you've got like 8, 10 core, depends on which. If you have an AMD chip, you might have 16 cores, and you just throw them all at whatever task they want, and you just run that. But now they're saying what you could do is, as long as the chip's smart enough and your operating system's smart enough, it can divvy up your streaming workloads, say OBS or whatever, and put that on the little cores, and then you put your big performance cores, dedicate them entirely to your game, and then you'll get the best frame rate possible, and you don't have to worry about anything else.
So the big reveal from the architecture day was there's a bit of hardware in there to help this all happen, isn't there?
I think that's the key. and it all really relies on how well that works. They've got to nail down their scheduler to make sure, and they've got this little extra bit of hardware that's going to work alongside Windows 11 scheduler at the moment, and they're going to that's going to essentially tell the OS what thread is doing what. Is it high priority? Is there something waiting that's at higher priority? And it'll tell the OS, and the OS gets to divvy up tasks between the threads, and it'll be like able to do that a bit more intelligently than it can do it now. Is the idea, so that the more efficient cores are being used when they need to be used, and the performance cores are being left for when they need to be used by something that's really high priority.
So this is the thread director, right?
Thread director.
Thread director. So this is kind of like an air traffic control chip for essentially the threads in flight. So it's like this goes over here, this goes over here, and so they're essentially saying that doing this in silicon is more efficient and smarter than basically just letting your operating system, just letting Windows figure it out itself.
I think they said the key thing here is it can give the OS more information than it could otherwise get about these threads. So it can give, not only can it update with the actual hardware telemetry, they were saying that's one thing it can offer anyway, just stuff about the hardware the OS just doesn't know, but it can also just analyze these tasks and threads like actually as they're working to say whether they need to go, and it'll then tell the OS, give way more information to the OS to then make a smart decision. At the moment, I think they were saying for the most part, the OS kind of just knows this one's the foreground app, so that's the main one. Everything in the background is just kind of, that's the secondary, so we don't have to think about those so much. And they're kind of hoping that the thread director will be able to then take the information, hand it to the OS, and actually get Alder Lake's chips, all of them being used as efficiently as possible. And that also allows you to then divvy up power to where it needs to go to most, and then increase frequencies where it needs to go to most. So, the theory being the high performance cores can then use more of the power. They can have higher frequencies, and you don't have to sap all that away just because you're kind of idly just powering a bunch of efficient cores that aren't really doing anything.
So we're talking about the OS here. Like, what OS are we talking about?
Well, we're specifically talking about Windows 11, which we don't have yet, but should arrive at the same time as Alder Lake or rough thereabouts. But the key here is Intel's been working with Microsoft on Windows 11 and their scheduler to get them all working in tandem and to have this smart system. And they've said already that if you're running on a different OS at the moment, expect it to just not be running at its best. So they're essentially saying it'll still run, but it'll use a more static scheduler instead of this very clever, smart one that they developed in tandem with Microsoft.
So they haven't said anything about being able to do this on Windows 10 then, so whether they'll be able to update Windows 10's scheduler.
No, I think that I was saying this one thing is perhaps one saving grace is if you have Alder Lake chip, that's probably the one thing that's stopping you, for most people, stopping them from getting Windows 11 will be their CPU not supporting it in some way. So perhaps it gets rid of it for most of it. But if you're on old legacy software or you're just a fan of Linux, you might get stuck and not be able to use Alder Lake to its full capabilities, as far as we know at the moment. And it definitely doesn't sound like they have immediate plans to support these OSs.
Interesting. So we covered Alder Lake, we covered the Xe-HPG Alchemist GPUs, we covered XeSS, XS. I'm into that.
XS. I like XS. Maybe it was always meant to be that.
Yeah, just reads like it. So was there anything else that we've missed? Anything else that we need to discuss?
It's a good question.
Roger's shiny esports t-shirt?
Yeah, they have a new t-shirt now.
The thing that got me actually is you got confirmation on a couple of things that from Alder Lake that we expected to be coming, but they've gone a bit quiet on. One of them was DDR5, which we knew was coming, that's fine. The other one was PCIe 5, which we still weren't sure until you went on this day, but it was happening.
It was rumored to be arriving, and then it was rumored to actually, no, they're not actually doing it. And now we're hearing, no, yeah, they are doing it. Whether that'll be a huge benefit to gaming, I personally can't see how it would be a huge benefit apart from SSDs, but PCIe 4.0 SSDs are already very fast. I think we'll eventually get to a point where that's used.
We're saturating, sequential reads and writes are saturating the bus anyway, so we kind of do need it, or I want it. I want faster SSDs. So
yeah, you're Mr. Storage though.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll find a use for it at some point. And gamers love to just,
bigger numbers.
Yeah, it's bigger numbers. It looks good. It sounds great. So yeah, I'm down for that.
Cool. Wow, that sounds good. I'm pretty pumped. I've got to say, I'm pretty pumped about the graphics side of things. I think having a third way in graphics cards is really tantalizing. And if they can even measure up to sort of like the mainstream performance of AMD and Nvidia in their first generation graphics cards, I'll be sold. And yeah, Alder Lake sounds good too. I'm excited. I think this is a good chance for Intel to come back. But I guess the proof is going to be in the pudding.
We'll have to see. But yeah, I'm excited too. Genuinely exciting times.
It does. It all looks good. It all looks very good. Let's see.
Well, thanks for joining us, guys, and thanks for taking that trip down to that London, Jacob, to go to the Intel Architecture Day 2021. And thanks for reporting it all back to us. So, and thank you for watching, and check back on PCGamer.com for more hardware and gaming fun times. And we'll see you again soon.